Welcome back, everyone, to the last part of this three-part look at Extra Histories series on the Zulu Empire. If you didn't see the first two parts of my reaction, the link is in the description to part 1, as well as the link to part 3 of the original content. Please check them out. We want to support our original content creators who are helping us all to learn. And hopefully you are learning right along with me as we dive into some more African history, an area I don't know a lot about. So I'm excited about this. I'm excited to see where the story goes. We'll offer some commentary where needed and where warranted, and look some things up if necessary as well. Let's dive in.
Last week, we saw the fall of Shaka. We saw Dingane meet his end at the hands of his half-brother, Mpande, and we saw the Zulu and the Dutch come to an uneasy truce when Mpande allied with them to overthrow his brother. This week, we'll see how European and native relations evolve as the 19th century moves on. But before we can talk about how the Europeans and the indigenous peoples of South Africa interacted, we have to take a closer look at the Europeans who were there. Who were they? Why were they there? What relation did they have to one another? Well, this isn't quite as straightforward as you might think. The two principal powers at play here were the English and the Dutch, but why they're both there and who they're loyal to is about to get complicated.
So I feel obliged to interject here and mention that it's not really just England. It's the UK at this point. So for those who aren't familiar with how it all works, it's England as a separate country up until the very beginning of the 1700s. England and Scotland and Wales are all under one crown, but England and Scotland especially are considered separate kingdoms up until the 1700s, which is when it becomes Great Britain, which is England, Wales, Scotland, all one kingdom at that point. They become united politically instead of just united under one crown. And then the beginning of the 1800s, we're talking about the United Kingdom, which is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Today it's Northern Ireland because Ireland is a separate country, but that came in the 20th century. So at this point, we're talking about basically all the British Isles. We're not just talking about England.
You see, back in 1652, the Dutch, under the Dutch East India Company, first settled Cape Town and sort of lay claim to South Africa. But that was like 150 years before our story started. We're looking at the late 18th and early 19th century here. And what was happening in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century? Right, Napoleon. During the French Revolution, French armies conquered the Dutch Republic, and the ruler of the Dutch Republic, the Prince of Orange, fled to Britain and asked them to take over his colonies so they wouldn't fall into the hands of the rampaging French.
And there's close, family ties here too, because remember it was William and Mary who are, William's Dutch. They were both both descendants of British royalty, who come in the Glorious Revolution right at the end of the 1600s and take over the kingdom. And so there's still some pretty close family ties here.
This left the Dutch in South Africa in a strange state of limbo. They were now ruled by the British, but were citizens of a nation which no longer existed, and might never come back for them. Many of the Dutch colonists chafed under British rule, and as the British began to expand their colonial efforts far more actively than the Dutch ever had, Dutch settlers began to move into the previously uncolonized interior of the country to escape British expansion. And in doing so, they started to see themselves as independent, neither British nor Dutch, but rather as a part of their own South African nation, who I'm going to refer to as the Boers from now on, since that's how they referred to themselves.
And to this day, there's a very heavy Dutch influence in South Africa, really more so than a British influence. A lot of us think of the British as being very active in that time and in that place, but it was the Dutch who really had the strongest influence, I think. So it made me think of something I wanted to take a look at here, which is a language that is spoken in South Africa. It's called Afrikaans, and it's actually kind of a hybrid language of Dutch, but also the native South African dialects. It's kind of like here in the United States, we have something called Pennsylvania Dutch. which actually has nothing to do with Dutch. It's actually a hybrid of German and English. It's spoken heavily by Amish communities. So it's German, but it's German that has like some real heavy English influence to it. Down in the south, there's Creole, which is kind of this weird French-English hybrid. So Afrikaans is another one of those things. It's where you have a language come into a place, but rather than becoming the dominant language, it kind of gets merged with what's local there. Really English is kind of a hybrid like that. It's influenced heavily by French and by other languages that came in, with the Norman invasion and things like that over time. But, I guess really you could say all languages are hybrids of the different influences, but this is a more recent example of that.
As they moved inland, the Boers began to set up their own republics on native territory, often Zulu territory. This created tension in the region that would eventually escalate to the extremity of violence. But for right now, European politics in South Africa really was a matter of the British wanting to limit the power and influence of the Boers, and the Boers wanting to assert their independence and ensure that the British didn't eventually assimilate all of South Africa. But the Boers were limited in number. They weren't exactly getting a large influx of immigrants from the country they'd declared independence from, and South Africa wasn't a primary British concern. So who did the Boers try to use as both pawns and proxies for their struggle? The local people, the Zulus. Okay, so back to the Zulus. Mpande is usually considered a weak king. I think this might be a little unfair, but he was certainly less warlike than his relatives.
If you're coming in as the king after the great conqueror, and you're going to be constantly compared to that previous guy, even if you weren't necessarily weak, you're going to be seen that way. It's the same thing with the people who came in after Napoleon in France. Everybody gets compared to Napoleon, and it's really kind of an unfair comparison because you're comparing to someone who was kind of a once in a millennia type figure. And it's really difficult to do that.
He negotiated a treaty defining borders with the British, and then gave additional lands to the Boers.
I should point out, I'm not comparing Shaka Zulu to Napoleon. Somebody asked me about that yesterday. When I said yesterday that when I made the comparisons of Shaka bringing in new innovative warfare styles and being able to conquer his neighbors because of that, and I made the comparison to Napoleon, I wasn't saying that Shaka was on the level of a Napoleon or a Julius Caesar. I was just trying to make a parallel that very often people who become great conquerors do so because they do something innovative and new.
But the British weren't just going to let the Boers expand, so this is where the British really started to encroach on Zulu sovereignty. They claimed that the land given to the Boers was in violation of the treaty the Zulus had made with them, and pressured Mpande into retaking the area. Thereafter, Mpande attempted to navigate the tightrope of keeping both the Boers and the British happy.
So, again, I like to make parallels, especially when I'm talking about a topic I don't necessarily know as much about. And this is something that happens throughout history. Great powers, not that we're necessarily talking about superpowers here, but great powers using a weaker local as a proxy. The U.S. and the Soviets did it in places like Afghanistan in the 1980s. It happened in Vietnam in the 1950s and 60s. It happened in Korea in the 1950s. All of those are examples from the Cold War. But this is something that has happened throughout history. And so here you have the Boers and the British using the Zulu as their proxy.
But he knew he'd need a buffer between him and the Europeans. So, in the 1850s, he decided to launch an invasion into Swaziland to secure himself from Boer encroachment. The British, though, saw this expansion as a threat, and once again forced him out of his gains, compelling him to abandon the territory he'd just won. During this campaign in Swaziland, it became very clear that Mpande's son, Cetshwayo, was a vigorous and capable leader. And here something strange happens. Cetshwayo just sort of slides into power without killing Mpande. That's not to say that there was no violence. After all, one of Mpande's other sons was also jockeying for power, as the Zulus became less content with Mpande's concessions to the British. Cetshwayo invaded the other son's territory and defeated both him and a small contingent of his British allies. Remarkably, he let the British go, and began a new diplomatic policy that aimed at keeping peace with both the colonial powers, while giving far less away to the Europeans than Mpande had. Then, somebody discovered diamonds in the area. This always screws things up.
Very similar thing happens in the United States with gold. The Great Sioux War that happens in 1876, the one we remember because it involves the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand. That war happened because after a treaty was made between the U.S. government and the tribes there over the Black Hills, shortly thereafter, somebody discovers gold in the area that had just been promised to the tribe in the treaty, and now all bets are off. So the same thing happens here. Resource curse leads to chaos. It's happened all throughout history.
European miners started pouring into South Africa, and with them, shopkeepers, tool traders, geologists, and all the other support personnel that a major mineral rush needs. But it was never enough. The demand for labor outpaced even the flood of fortune seekers coming to South Africa, and so the European mining firms began to look hungrily at the native population. For the most part, the Zulus and the surrounding tribes were content. Working a diamond mine is unpleasant. The Zulu already had all they needed with their farms and their cattle, and now with all these essentially unproductive Europeans flooding in, the Zulu could get a pretty good price for any surplus food they grew. This led mining conglomerates to offer guns for labor, and the British government to start taking more drastic steps toward
What could possibly go wrong? Offering guns for labor. A little foreshadowing there, maybe.
expansion. The British wanted to secure any potential diamond mines they could, which meant pushing into native and Boer territory at an unheard-of rate. At the same time, the British also wanted to start consolidating their hold over South Africa in general, and to integrate the outlying tribes with the growing diamond economy. Doing this basically meant destroying the traditional South African way of life, and stepping on agreements made with the Boers. But the funny thing is, while the British government wanted to make all this happen, their local South African ruling government, especially in Cape Town, wanted nothing to do with it. Britain needed to bring them in line. Thus enters Henry Bartle Frere. Frere had once been an ardent civil servant for the British in India. He had done notable service during the Indian Rebellion, and had risen to be governor of Bombay. He'd been noticed by the Conservative Secretary of State for the colonies, Lord Carnarvon, whose big project was to confederate many of the British colonies. Carnarvon had just successfully done so with Canada, and now he was dead set on doing the same with South Africa. Carnarvon had Frere appointed High Commissioner of South Africa, and promised that he would become the first Governor-General there, a position that almost certainly came with a peerage, if he could bring the entire area under British control and set up an effective government. Frere agreed, and began to assess what he would need to do in order to achieve this. His solution was basically annex and suppress everybody, but he especially noted the need to break the power of the Zulus. The local political elite tried to warn him that with the recent British expansion, tensions were high, and any minor event might throw the whole region into war. But Frere was having none of that, and began looking for an opportunity to expand.
See, this is the problem when you send people in who maybe have success in other places, but don't know the local situation. They don't know the population, they don't know the intricacies and the nuances that are involved, and they don't understand the cultures, and they just come in and think that, well, what I did over there, it's going to work here too, and they don't listen to the people who are on the ground who understand the situation.
His first chance came from a minor tribal skirmish between two outlying tribes. How minor? Well, it started as a bar fight. That didn't stop Frere from using the incident as cause to declare war on one of the tribes, against the vociferous objections of the local Cape Colony government. The Cape government succeeded in at least making sure that their local fast light commando troops prosecuted the war, rather than the might of the British Royal Army. The war was swift and decisive, but the Cape government had no interest in annexation, and so returned the land to the native people. Frere, furious over this, basically used this act of insubordination to have them effectively removed from power, and have
So you get rid of the only people who really do understand the situation.
himself granted total governmental control over South Africa. Shortly after this, he enacted a law that demanded that all native Africans had to give up their guns.
The ones they had been paid for their labor with. You can see how this is going to go.
Not Europeans, mind you, just the native Africans. Well, nobody was falling for that one. The native tribes were far smarter than Frere gave them credit for, and rose in revolt rather than give up their arms. This time, Frere unleashed the mighty British Imperial Army. But, being unfamiliar with the terrain, not accustomed to the weather, and burdened by their heavier armaments, the British army couldn't even find the rebels, much less beat them. Finally, Frere called back in the local frontier commando troops of the Cape Colony government he'd just overthrown, and the commandos managed to engage and defeat some of the rebelling tribesmen. While this allowed Frere to annex their land, it sent much of the rest of South Africa into a guerrilla war that would nearly bankrupt Cape Colony. But this wouldn't stop Bartle Frere. He saw the escalating conflict simply as an expedient. Now, the British government as a whole didn't actually want a war with the native peoples of South Africa, but Carnarvon, who had appointed Frere, was an opponent of the current government, and he did. If the tribes rose up, it made going to war with them and eventually annexing their land much simpler politically. And so, with that in mind, Frere finally went after the crown jewel of South Africa, Zululand. On December 11th, 1878, Frere sent an ultimatum to Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, demanding that he disband his armies entirely and accept a British observer into his court.
And so, if you've ever seen the movie Zulu, or I think Zulu Dawn, I think is the sequel, the one about Rorke's Drift, this is the time period we're talking now. These are the very famous battles of Island Luanda and Rorke's Drift. And some of you were commenting on previous video about what was the one that I did the reaction to of the Sabaton song. Well, that's the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which was in the aftermath of the larger kind of massacre of British troops at Island Luanda.
He gave Cetshwayo 1 month to comply. These demands were impossible. Needless to say, on January 11th, 1879, the British and the Zulu Empire were at war. Join us next time for the Anglo-Zulu War, the battle that raised the Zulu to an almost mythic status in Western lore, and the final fates of both Cetshwayo and Bartle Frere.
Okay, so I guess there's a fourth part. When I originally looked at this, I thought there was only 3 parts to this. So let's take a look and see how many there are. Okay, so it looks like 4 is the last part of it. So we'll come back with that tomorrow. I'm excited to kind of wrap this up, and we'll talk about something that's a part of the history that I know a little bit more about. So it'll be interesting to kind of take a look at some of these large, very historic battles that I previously mentioned. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will be back tomorrow with the final part of this series. Thanks for watching.